Okay, we have Dr. Günter Bechly, who is a German paleontologist. He's a senior fellow with the Discovery Institute for Science and Culture in Seattle, so in the USA. He's got a very wide range of prior scientific experience in his field. He graduated, he's a leading expert on the fossils, on dragonflies. He earned his diploma, MSc in biology, and his PhD in geosciences from the Erhard Karls University of Tübingen, Germany. He worked between 1999 to 2016 as a curator for amber and fossil insects at the State Museum of Natural History in Stuttgart, Germany. And he has co-authored and authored 160 scientific publications, including a co-edited book published by Cambridge University Press and a popular science book on evolution. He has discovered and named more than 180 new species and 11 biological groups named in his honor, and he has partaken in various TV documentaries, media coverage, ranging from the BBC, Scientific American, and National Geographic. And he is, from my point of view, he's one of the leading scientists in the intelligent design camp. And for those of you who are new to this theory, this is the aim of this program. It's to show you, introduce you to the idea of what we call intelligent design, which is a theory that comes after the Darwinian model that Charles Darwin introduced. And I'm going to let Dr. Beckley introduce some of his work to us, and hopefully we can have some questions after that. So off you go, Dr. Beckley.
So thank you for this very kind introduction. So before we will have a chat later, I will have a little presentation prepared. So what I want to show is that there is a problem for Darwinian, especially Neo-Darwinian evolution from the fossil record, which may be surprising to many people because many people think that the fossil record is strong support for Darwin's theory. So many evolutionary biologists know that there are problems, and Ernst Mayr, one of the founders of the modern evolutionary synthesis, said that there are discontinuities everywhere, especially striking in the fossil record. So let's look at some of them and why they are a problem. Little introduction, and we can talk about this later, is that I came to Darwinism myself in the Darwin year, which is a little bit ironic. So I was responsible at the Natural History Museum in Stuttgart for organizing the largest event in Germany celebrating the Darwin year 2009, which was the 200th birthday of Charles Darwin and the 105th anniversary of the first publication of The Origin of Species. And there I organized a large exhibition. And at this exhibition, we also had a module which had as subject the modern critics of Darwin, creationists, intelligent design proponents. And I wanted to mock them in a way with this medieval wooden balance, where on one side you have a pile of books by intelligent design proponents and creationists, and on the other side books by Darwin. And then the balance goes down on Darwin's side because he has the heavy-weighted arguments and all the rest is nonsense. And because I had to buy these books, I later looked in these books, and I was very much surprised to not find religious arguments counter the propaganda that I heard before, but scientific arguments. And then I studied them more and more and more, became a Darwin critic myself, recognized that these arguments have merit, and so became an intelligent design proponent ultimately. So if we look at scientific theories, every theory makes certain predictions. And one of the predictions by Darwin's theory is that big changes in the history of life can be explained by an accumulation of many small changes where each small change is probable. So he postulated a gradual development. And this gradual development is essential. It's not just a side issue. Therefore, he said 6 times in his book, Origin of Species, Natura non facit saltus, nature doesn't make jumps. And Richard Dawkins is still of the same opinion. 2009, he said evolution not only is a gradual process, as a matter of fact, it has to be gradual if it is to do any explanatory work. And of course, if we look at the geological evidence, already Darwin knew that it is not showing this gradual development. And Darwin said in his book, geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely granulated organic chain. And this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. And he tried to explain this inconvenient fact away with the imperfection of the geological record. And even 100 years later, the most influential paleontologist of the 20th century, George Gaylord Simpson, who is also one of the co-founders of Neo-Darwinism, of the modern evolutionary synthesis, he wrote in 1960, "It's a feature of the known fossil record that most taxa appear abruptly. They are not, as a rule, led up to by a sequence of almost imperceptibly changing forerunners." And then he says, this is the most important theoretical problem in the whole history of life. So this problem is still remaining. And even 60 years later, it has become rather worse than that it was solved. So, of course, a lot of critics will say, well, but these are just gaps of knowledge and gaps, as Philip Gingerich, a paleontologist, said, gaps of evidence are gaps of evidence and not evidence of gaps. But is this really true? We can actually find out quite easily with statistical tests. And to show how this is done, my friend Paul Nelson had a very nice analogy. He said, imagine you have a new hobby, you do beachcombing, and you walk along to the shore and collect what the flood washes in, and you collect shells and mussels and starfish and so on. And every day you find something new. But after a while, when you do it, repetition sets in until you reach a point where you only find stuff that you have found already many times before. And then you know that you have reached this point of saturation and sampling where you know what is out there, what can be washed on the shore. And the same approach is used in paleontology. There it's called the collector curve. And in this diagram, you plot the effort that you have to invest to find new stuff, new fossils, and in the vertical axis, the new species you discover. And you see in the beginning, the curve is very steep, and you don't have to invest a lot of effort, not much time and money to find new stuff, but later the curve flattens, and then you have sampled enough to know that what is out there. And when there are remaining gaps, these gaps are real gaps and not artifacts of undersampling. And these statistical tests have been applied in most groups of organisms, and there are many papers that show that the fossil record on the level that is important for this question of macroevolution, so on the level of, let's say, families, is sufficiently complete to know that the gaps are real. Of course, the fossil record will ever be incomplete on the low taxonomic level of species. So maybe only 1% of all species that ever lived have been preserved, but we have most of the families that ever lived. So for example, 80% of all modern families of land vertebrates are represented in the fossil record, and we can extrapolate this on other groups in other time horizons as well. So I will show some examples, and in these examples, I will show that certain new body plans, new groups of organisms appeared in windows of time of 5 to 10 million years, which is very short biologically. This may be surprising because you may think that's a long time for humans, but biologically, 5 million years is just the lifespan of a single species, basically. So this means that you have a transformation from one body plan to the other during the lifetime of one or two species. And this shows how short this time span is in biological or evolutionary terms. So first example would be origin of life. First animals appear immediately after the first moment in Earth history where there could be life in the oceans, right after the so-called late heavy bombardment, before the oceans were evaporated by meteorite impact several times. Together with the first organisms, we have the origin of photosynthesis, not after hundreds of millions of years of chemical and biological evolution, but right at the beginning, the most complex physiological process we know. We have the so-called Avalon explosion, which is about 560, 570 million years ago, this appearance of these strange so-called Ediacaran biota, strange organisms. Nobody knows what they really are, but they appear out of nowhere without precursors in the preceding layers and then disappear. And then we have the famous Cambrian explosion about 520 million years ago. It has been called evolution's Big Bang. And there all the different body plans of animals like arthropods and mollusks and vertebrates and so on appear suddenly, again, without precursors in the preceding layers. And for a while, paleontologists hoped that this is just an artifact because there were no suitable layers before, or the organisms were too small or too soft-bodied. But meanwhile, we have discovered a lot of localities that can preserve small and soft-bodied organisms from the time prior to the Cambrian explosion. And actually, we have found localities of the so-called Burgess Shale type from the Ediacaran prior to the Cambrian explosion. And the Burgess Shale is this famous locality of these wonderful organisms from the Cambrian explosion, from the Rocky Mountains in Canada. And identical, sedimentologically and geologically identical formations and layers have been discovered, dozens of them from the Ediacaran, and there are no animals there, only algae. So the Cambrian explosion cannot be explained away as an artifact of preservation. And in the next geological era, we have the great Ordovician biodiversification event about 470 million years ago, with a steep increase of diversity on the family level of marine invertebrates. And this is interesting because it's the opposite of what we would expect from the Darwinian prediction. Darwin would predict that first we have small differences of a species splitting, and then over millions of years and hundreds of millions of years, they will diversify and ultimately end up to be different phyla. But what we find in the fossil record is right at the beginning, the different phyla without precursors. And then later, these phyla are differentiated into different variations, for example, in this Ordovician event. So it's a top-down pattern instead of a bottom-up pattern predicted by Darwin. And then the next example would be the origin of land plants in the Silurian Devonian about 400 million years ago. And this has been called in a mainstream science paper the terrestrial equivalent of the much debated Cambrian explosion. In the Devonian, about 400 million years ago, we have the so-called Devonian Nekton revolution. All these names, these explosions and revolutions and big bangs, they have been named as such by mainstream evolutionary paleontologists. And they have been named revolutions for a reason. Nothing that is happening gradually, slowly over long periods of time is called a revolution or a big bang off or a explosion. So the Nekton revolution is this sudden increase in the Devonian of free swimming, active swimming organisms like different groups of fish and of cephalopods and so on. And correlated with this, the so-called odontode explosion, which is the appearance of different tooth-like structures in different groups of fish around the same time frame. And then in the Upper Devonian, we have the terrestrial revolution with the appearance of walking tetrapods, land vertebrates, which actually are so sudden that they appear prior to all these so-called fisherpods, these fish-like alleged precursors. But the first evidence for actually walking land animals is millions of years older than all of those. And in my own group of expertise in insects, we find this Carboniferous insect explosion. All the different groups of winged insects appear suddenly in the Upper Carboniferous. And it's not only primitive groups like dragonflies and mayflies and locusts or cockroaches, but also these very sophisticated groups which have these complete metamorphoses with a pupal stage where the whole body plan is dissolved in this resting stage, and the caterpillar develops into either a beetle or wasp or a butterfly. This is present at the very beginning of the first flying insects and not after 100 million years of slow evolution. In the Triassic, that would be the next age in Earth history, about 250 million years ago and younger. We have multiple explosions, and they have been called by Peter Ward, who is a paleontologist and an opponent of intelligent design, but he has written a book in 2006 where he said all these Triassic explosions were as important for animal life on land as the Cambrian explosion was for marine animal life. And you find from different groups, from dinosaurs, from turtles, from crocodiles, from lizards, and from mammals, the first representatives in a small window of time in the Triassic. You find a sudden increase in marine reptiles from 0 to 15 different families of marine reptiles, just a small selection here. And for example, ichthyosaurs, within the lifespan of a single larger vertebrate species, you find this transition from monitor lizard-like terrestrial animals to a completely fish-like ichthyosaur. And you find the same pattern in Triassic for gliding and flying reptiles, and also with dinosaurs. And there was recently a paper in Nature Communications in 2018, and the authors found an explosive increase in dinosaurian abundance. And the main author, Bernardi, wrote in the press release for this study, it's amazing how clear-cut the change from no dinosaurs to all dinosaurs was. The same is in the Cretaceous, lower Cretaceous, about 120 million years ago, with the origin of flowering plants. This was already known to Darwin. He called it an abominable mystery, and he hoped that the mystery will be solved with more fossils found, but the mystery has become even more acute with the accumulation of more evidence in the time after Darwin. And this also shows that this is not an artifact. If it would be an artifact of knowledge, it should become smaller with increasing knowledge, but the problem became bigger. And also here, mainstream papers said flowers sprang forth during the Cretaceous period as fully formed as Aphrodite. Butterflies, the same pattern in the lower Tertiary, they appear suddenly. Modern birds, the same, also in the lower Tertiary, and it has been called the Big Bang of bird evolution. And the same pattern with mammals. All the placental mammal orders appear suddenly in a narrow window of time in the Paleogene, and they don't appear where they would be expected according to molecular clock studies. There they should be in the Cretaceous, but there's nothing. They are all appearing where you see these red dots in this yellow time frame in the lower Tertiary, and many of them fully formed like the oldest bats. They look basically like modern bats. And even for our own genus, where many people think there is this transition from ape-like forms to Homo, but actually there is a big gap between the Australopithecines and the genus Homo. And the origin of our own genus has been by one of the most renowned paleoanthropologists, specialists for human evolution, John Hawkes, in a paper. It has been called the Big Bang Theory of the genus Homo. And even for our cultural development, if you look at evidence for symbolic thinking, like carvings and artistry and music and paintings and so on, we find a sudden appearance of these behaviors around 40,000 years ago in the Upper Paleolithic, and this has been called the Upper Paleolithic Human Revolution, or the creativity explosion. So all these discontinuities, not only that they are empirically contradicting the prediction of Darwin's theory, but they raise another problem. And the problem is the following. We have very well established windows of times for these major transitions in the history of life. And we can ask, do these windows of time, are they sufficient to accommodate the necessary genetic changes to make these body plan transitions? And this can be done with population genetics. We have the mathematical toolkit in standard population genetics to do the math and to look. And what we know is that sometimes we need coordinated mutations. That means it's not sufficient for major changes to have a single point mutation. What you need is that several mutations come together, and we know experimentally that often these mutations, each for itself, is neutral. It cannot be selected for. It has neither an advantage nor a disadvantage. And only when they come together, then they convey this evolutionary advantage. This is called coordinated mutations. And they create a special waiting time problem. Waiting time problem is called because you have to wait for the right mutations to occur in the population, and then you have to wait for the mutations to spread in the population to really transform it. And we know this should proceed by random mutation and natural selection, but we also know that natural selection can only work when there is an adaptive, either positive or negative value. And we know that some advantages require 2 or more mutations coming together to have such an adaptive value. And so we can look for these time constraints and do the math. And if you play with the parameters, it's not easy to solve this problem. For example, if you look at a big population, there the time to get the mutation is shorter because you have a lot of possibilities for mutations to occur, but you need a lot more time for the mutations to spread in a big population. If you take a small population, then the waiting time to get the mutation is becoming a lot bigger because you have less possibilities. But on the other hand, the mutations can spread faster. So these 2 options cancel each other out, and you cannot use these parameters to solve the problem. And also recombination in sexual organisms, where you can combine the genome of the paternal and the maternal line, it doesn't help. This has been calculated by mainstream population geneticists. And there's a paper by Christiansen et al., even already from 1998, which shows that recombination doesn't help to solve the waiting time problem. By the way, there are a lot of papers in mainstream science about the waiting time problem. That is nothing that creationists have come up with, or it's a well-known problem in mainstream science. And we can do the math, and we put in certain parameters that we can either know by experiments like mutation rates, or we can make reasonable estimates about population sizes and generation times, and then we can calculate. And this whole problem was discovered as an argument for intelligent design by Michael Behe. And he looked actually at malaria, and he looked how long did it take for malaria to develop resistance against the malaria drugs. And he found that in the case of chloroquine, it took much longer, several decades. And the reason is that experimentally we found out it required 2 coordinated mutation to get this resistance. And then he looked at the time it took for this resistance, and then he transposed these data of the population size of malaria and the short generation time of malaria transmitters on vertebrates, and looked how long would have taken this for, let's say, something like ancestral humans to get a single coordinated mutation. And he found out, not by simulating, not by doing math, but just by using these empirical data and transforming the population size and generation time on the much lower population size and much longer generation times of vertebrates. And he arrived at a time of 10 to the power of 15 years in the case of humans. That's longer than the existence of the universe. And of course, mainstream evolutionists try to refute this. And there's a famous paper by Durrett and Schmidt, 2008. And they said, oh, he got it all wrong. They did a mathematical simulation. And they calculated that 10 to the power of 15 is unrealistic. It's only 216 million years. Even if this would be correct, this would, of course, also be prohibitive, because the time of the separation of the human lineage from the chimp lineage is just 6 million years. So to get a single coordinated mutation for humans, that would be only 6 million years available, but 216 million years required, even according to mainstream evolutionists. But if you have such a difference between empirical data as used by Behe and a simulation, a calculation, which always has to do simplifications, then of course it's rather likely that Behe's numbers are closer to the truth than these 260 million years. But anyway, there have been other studies like Sanford 2015, which showed that even for point mutations, the waiting time in an ancestral human population would have been 1.5 to 16 million years. And this is a problem even for point mutation. If you look at the chimp and human genome, you will often hear this number, we are 95% similar. That's fine. 5% difference translates to millions of differences in the genome that all require mutations that have to arise and have to spread in the population, which is called fixation, the spreading of the mutation. And the time simply is not there. At Discovery Institute, we are working on a joint research project since several years, and we have developed a new mathematical model based on previous models that have been published. We improved on them, included possible other parameters like back mutations and so on. And we have published this, the first thing in a Springer Science book, the second paper in the Journal of Theoretical Biology recently. And we are now working on a concrete application of this model on the example of whale origins. And in whale origins, we have a nice lineage of so-called transitional fossils where we can narrow down this time frame that is available to transform an ancestral whale that was still looking like a pig, like Pachycetus, to a fully marine whale like Dorudon. And the time that is available is only about 4.5 million years. Now, my colleague Richard von Sternberg, he did the math and did this calculation, and he arrived at a waiting time of 43 million years. That's 10 times the time that is available. And to make this transition, you would not only need one coordinated mutation, because you have a lot of body plan re-engineering that is required. You have to transform the forelimbs into flippers, the hind limbs have to be reduced, the tail has to be transformed into fluke with a different movement, which requires ball vertebra. You need a different birth process with tail first instead of head first, different kind of nursing, different kidney tissues because of drinking of salt water, different lungs surface because the lung collapses during diving and then re-expands. You need a cooling system for the male testes, which are internalized to get this streamlined body. And all these complicated changes require, as we know by Evo-Devo studies, all such characters are so-called polygenetic. They need many mutations to make changes. This is this countercurrent heat exchange systems of whales. And the problem is even made more acute by results by one famous ID critic, that's Donald Prothero. He's an enemy of intelligent design, a paleontologist, and his special field is larger mammals, especially of the wider relationship of whales, the so-called artiodactyls, which is the pair-hooved or how is it called, even-toed ungulates. And he found that the lifespan of such a species is on average about 4 million years. So this transition from a pig-like ancestor to a fully dolphin-like marine whale happened within the lifespan of a single species. Is this reasonable? If something like this happened in the past, and it happened many, many times, as you have seen with these abrupt appearances and explosions in the fossil record, shouldn't we find something in the modern fauna as well? And I recently proposed a challenge to Darwinists called the Species Pair Challenge, because we have a data bank that allows us to check this problem. There's a large data bank on the web called timetree.org, where you have almost 100,000 living species of all groups, from plants to invertebrates and vertebrates. And you can select any pair and check, based on molecular clock studies, when did they diverge. And so you can check, when did eagles diverge from tulips, and you arrive somewhere at maybe 500 million years or something. So what if we look for species pairs that diverge in this time frame, 5 million years? Do we find any kind of morphological difference similar to Pachycetus and Dorudon to these to this whale transition? No, nowhere. I don't have the time to show the examples. I recently published an article on Evolution News where you can find many examples from all groups of organisms. In this time frame, they usually look identical for laymen. And here is just an example from whales. In this time frame, 4 million years, what you get is something like the common dolphin and the bottlenose dolphin, but not the difference of a Pachycetus, of a pig-like animal to a dolphin-like animal. So what is the Bayesian likelihood that we find many examples in the fossil record, even though there are only much less many species described from the fossil record than living species? There's an estimated more than 8 million living species, and no such examples in the living flora and fauna. The likelihood is basically zero. So mainstream evolutionists admit this problem. It's not just that we make this stuff up. I attended a conference in 2016 at the prestigious Royal Society in London, and it was called New Trends in Evolutionary Biology, and the keynote was held by a famous Austrian evolutionary biologist called Professor Gerd Müller. And in his keynote talk, he had this slide. He showed explanatory deficits of the MS theory. Explanatory deficits, what the theory cannot explain. MS stands for modern synthesis, which is another word for Neo-Darwinism. And he lists among those deficits that the theory cannot explain: phenotypic complexity, complex organs, phenotypical novelty, new structures, new body plans arising in the history of life, and non-gradual forms of transition, these non-gradual explosions and abrupt appearances that I showed before. If the theory cannot explain this, then it failed as a theory for macro evolution. And I would suggest that the better explanation is not Darwinism, but an infusion of information from outside the system, because we know by our regular experience that this is a cause that can produce this kind of bursts of creativity. We know it from all fields of our own activity, if it is engineering or art or whatever, writing, computer programming, whatever. Intelligence can cause these sudden jumps in creativity to new constructions. And a bottom-up mechanistic process like Neo-Darwinism cannot. There's also no computer simulation, no laboratory experiment that ever has shown that something like this could happen by a natural mechanistic process. So that should be enough as an introduction of some of the arguments that convinced me. If you want to know more about my work, you can look at my website at www.beckley.at. Or you can look at evolutionnews.org and search for articles I've written, or look at idthefuture.com podcast for podcast episodes with me. So there you can find a lot of articles and podcasts concerning this field of intelligent design and the fossil record. So thanks a lot. I will stop the presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Beckley, for that wonderful presentation on, just a brief introduction to the theory of intelligent design, right, which will be quite new for a lot of our listeners. And the reason I say this, so I'm a secondary school physics teacher, and I grew up not knowing anything about ID if it wasn't for my dad, who was involved with ID. But the reason I say that is because the textbooks that we have in school, and I'm sure around the world, you will never find the word intelligent design whatsoever. Right. It is Darwin, you will find him there, and even at age 15, between the ages between 14 to 16, depending on the educational systems around the world, students will be introduced to this idea of natural selection, genetic variation.
Right.
And
by the way, if I could add something to this, is I would be fine that intelligent design is not in the textbooks, because the textbooks should teach, let's say, the current scientific consensus, and that's okay. Intelligent design should really win the science, and then it can be introduced into the mainstream curricula. But what I find disappointing is not that they don't include intelligent design in the school textbook, but that they avoid talking about any problems of Darwin's theory. And that should be a question of scientific integrity and honesty, to show that there are also problems and evidences that point against the theory. And then you can leave it to the progress in science, or to everybody making up their minds themselves what could be the alternative. But that is really a shortcoming of the school textbooks, that they don't address problems.
And absolutely, and I like, I mean, you alluded it to in your talk with regards to whale evolution from a four-legged terrestrial mammal, and can you just remind me what was their idea of the time frame with which they think this happened, the evolution of the whale?
Yeah, it's about 1.5 million years to get from this pig-like pachycetus to a fully marine, whale-like, dolphin-like organism like Basilosaurus or Dorodon.
4.5 million years is
1.5 million years, and that's, as I said, about the lifespan of a single species, which doesn't mean that you could have different speciation events happening in this time. So it's not like a species at the beginning of its lifespan, not of the single organism, but of the whole species. How long does the species exist? That there could be one speciation event at the beginning and one at the end. There could be speciation events in between, but it gives at least an impression how short this time biologically is to have such a major re-engineering happening during the lifespan of a single species. That's certainly not what Darwin expected to find.
Yeah, and no, thank you for that. And the reason why I love this example is, so you say 4.5 million years, okay, and to the average person on the street, I'll think, well, that's plenty of time. However, this particular transition in whale evolution, it's not even addressed in textbooks. What they give is the finch's beak, or they show a lot of leopard moths. So they show examples of what we would call
microevolution,
variation within a species, and even within a small time frame. But I think the point that you were getting at, and what I would like listeners to think about, is, you know, the different transitions, the changes. You know, we have arms having to become fins and so on, and you know, different breathing systems, and all the things that you mentioned. So if you actually list all of those changes and you do the mathematical calculations, I think you said there's 43 million years is the calculated time frame or waiting time.
It was a rough early calculation. We have now a much more sophisticated study, and there the time frames are even much longer. So it would be a very generous point to say it's really just these 43 million years.
And so I trained as a physicist, and of course mathematics is what we would call the most foundational of all the sciences. So for me, what I find when I talk to non-theists is they're very big on science. They say, oh, science has disproved God or whatever, but then intelligent design, what I love about it really takes math seriously and talks about statistics seriously. So like what you've talked about is the problems with these transitional forms, and of course your specialism is in paleontology, where you look at the fossil record, and from the current evidence, and of course the biologists, evolutionary biologists are welcome to say we still haven't found them yet, and for sure we should still keep looking. But to this date, you know, and I love this analogy, and you talked about the Cambrian explosion, which happened 530 million years ago. But if you were to take geological time, and we take the earliest life, 3.9, is it billion years?
Yeah, 3.8 billion years ago is the oldest life, and Cambrian explosion would be 520 million years ago.
So for our listeners, this is a wonderful analogy. If we take a clock, 24-hour clock, and we let the dial go from 0 hours, and then when you get, so you'd have from 3.8 billion years, first primitive life forming, going the way right to the approximately 21st hour, right? So we have a long time where paleontologists, we still haven't found any change. The life, the single-celled organism life, is pretty much static. But around this 21st hour, within a space of 20 million upper limit to 10 million years, we have this emergence of lots and lots of major new species, major new body plans. We have organs such as the eye, central nervous system, and many organs, complex organs, forming at this time within a space of equivalent of 2 minutes in this cycle, right? So you imagine 21st hours geological time, and within 2 minutes, all these major body plans appearing. And what I don't like in this for me is very different to what Darwin suggested with what we call the tree of life. So the bottom-up approach, where we have a slow, gradual, incremental change of diversity with these small multiple mutations, genetic variation. But as of now, the evidence doesn't show that. We don't have any fossils prior to that. Can you give what are the mainstream scientists saying with regards to this problem? Why there are no transitional forms prior to the Cambrian explosion?
Right. So the most heard explanation is this artifact hypothesis, as Stephen Meyer called it, that they say it's just a preservational artifact. The fossil record is incomplete. That was already Darwin's cop-out, that he said, well, the fossil record is incomplete. Imagine you would have a kind of encyclopedia, which is an original 10,000 pages, and then you would only find one half page of each book, and it would be unreadable, most sentences, and you just have some fragments, and then you would have to reconstruct the whole thing from this. So that is the general point, and that's why I showed this these statistics, how complete the fossil record meanwhile is, and our knowledge of the fossil record since Darwin's time has changed exponentially and has increased exponentially. Just one example from my own field of research. In the 1960, the predecessor of my position at the museum was Professor Willy Hennig, and Willy Hennig is probably the most well-known German biologist. He's kind of revered in America as the kind of second Darwin, because he developed this modern phylogenetic systematics, cladistics. This method is based on Willy Hennig's research. But he was an entomologist, and he wrote a book about insect evolution, a famous book. And in his book, he wrote that one of the most unfortunate gaps in our knowledge of the fossil history of insects is the almost complete lack of fossils from the Cretaceous. In the meantime, since the decades since this book was published, we have discovered dozens and dozens of localities in China, for Liaoning. We have discovered amber localities in Burma. We have discovered the Crato limestones, the Wealden in England, the lava amber in Spain, and so on and so on. 100,000s of fossil insects from the Cretaceous, from all kinds of orders. These gaps that may have existed as gaps of knowledge in Darwin's time, they have been closed with these big increases in our knowledge, and the gaps that remain, they have not only not been closed, as I already said, they have, with this increasing knowledge, have become more acute, more sharp, more severe. So this shows these gaps that are remaining are real gaps, and these abrupt transitions are really abrupt. They are not based on an incomplete fossil record. They are appearing abrupt because they happened abruptly, and we have to explain how could this happen. And one of the other explanations, except the artifact hypothesis, is that people say, well, maybe it was not necessary to slowly develop new genes and new proteins. Maybe it was just the developmental toolkit, the so-called gene regulatory networks that had to be rewired in a way. This would be like, imagine you have Lego bricks, and the Lego bricks are already existing, and then you can recombine them into different models, and so the body plans would be easy. You just need a few mutations to rearrange these Lego bricks. But this has been in recent times refuted by new studies, like the studies by Paps and Holland, who have shown that in each of the groups, for example, in these Metazoan groups, the animal body plans that came up in the Cambrian explosion, all of them, they have unique genes, unique proteins. And if you think about it, of course they need new proteins. If you want to make an arthropod from some worm-like precursor, and you need an exoskeleton and a compound eye and a nervous system and so on, and articulation of the legs, you need new proteins, you need new genes to make this. The idea that you just have to rewire some programs, some program modules is ridiculous. So that's basically the two main explanations they try.
Yeah, and let's touch upon that idea of you talk about these new proteins that are needed for example, an exoskeleton.
Yes.
I think one thing that I would like to get across in this program, and a lot of people don't think about simply because they're not educated, it's not taught in schools, at least at the secondary school level, which and not everybody takes science at university. So, is the complexity of the cell, the inner workings of the cell, and protein synthesis in general. We know that Francis Crick, in the 60s, when the genetic code or the shape of DNA was mapped, and of course later research found the specificity of the nucleotide bases and how that was responsible for not only the development or reproduction of that species, but just the development. And it's actually very complex, right? From a fertilized cell to get your respective organs, organelles, and that I want to bring in this idea of genetic information. So where did that originate, and how does, because I think the problem with Darwin at the time, he thought the cell was very simple, right? And but I think with modern genetics, we see the complexity of these processes. But I like your so just I would like to ask you or comment on this issue of, because I've heard this this analogy, for example, from going from one species to another species, we could have one novel, that's some novel in the past, some story that some author has written. So they put thought into this story, and then we give it to I don't know, a bunch of monkeys or whatever, and they literally somehow, or like a computer program where they will literally jumble the words, the sentences together, and somehow after some time that work of fiction will become another work of fiction.
Yes. Yeah.
So the idea is we have some original genetic information, but the random mutations occur over time to come up with another new, vastly different species. And I think what I like about this analogy, it's okay, at some point we can say, okay, mathematically there is a very, very small percentage, but actually it is a, you know, it's very, very small when we consider
impossible with the probabilistic resources of our universe. It's not only unlikely, it's unlikely to the point of being impossible, because the even if you would say every elementary particle in the whole known universe would be one possible mutation, then it would not be sufficient to get this kind of transition. So I think, but of course, evolutionary biologists would say, well, it's not, we don't say it's random, it's just the mutation is random, but then we have this selection process, and selection is not random. But the problem with this approach is that, of course, selection can only select what is there. So you first need the mutation and then you can select it. So the problem is, as it is often said, not the survival of the fittest, but the arrival of the fittest. And another problem is that if you look at the task that has to be accomplished, as you said, for example, to get a new protein, you can imagine a protein is like a sentence, and it is built up from amino acids, and the amino acids are like letters in an alphabet. It's also about the same number. So we have about, I think it's 21 different amino acids. So it's similar to the number of letters. And then the combination of letters makes different proteins. So you have a vast combinatorial space. Usually proteins have a length between 200 and some thousand amino acids. And there are, of course, you have this multidimensional combinatorial search space. And now the question is, if selection would help, can you get from point A, from a functional protein, to another point of a protein? Functional means that it folds in a three-dimensional structure, in a tertiary structure, because if this doesn't happen, then all function that a protein can have is being sticky or something like that. So to have a real biological function, it needs to have these complex three-dimensional folding structures. And these islands of function, they are so widely separated in this combinatorial search space that selection doesn't help to get from point A to point B, because that would only be possible if you would, let's say, need 2 or 3 amino acid changed, and then you reach the next point which you could select for, which would have a positive change. But in reality is you have to change 50 or 100 amino acids correctly at the same time to jump from one island of function to another island of function. And my colleague Doug X, he did the calculation and experiments on this, and he found that only 1 to the 10 to the power of 77 combinations of a certain length of a protein is folding in this biological meaningful sense. So it's so unlikely, it's impossible, even with natural selection helping the random mutation to get from one functional protein to another. It's impossible. And the same problems with the origin of life, where this whole selection thing doesn't help at all, because you need a replicator, a macromolecule that can self-replicate to get this process of Darwinian evolution going. If you have no replication, then you have no copy errors, and then you have no mutation and no selection. But to get this process going, you need a replicator, and this replicator, all the evidence we have has to be so complex that it cannot be explained with a random fluke, but you can also not explain it with Darwinian evolution, because you need it to get Darwinian evolution. So it's an unsolvable problem. And there are already origin of life researchers like Eugene Koonin who invoke infinite multiverses, parallel universes to explain the origin of life, because it's such a difficult problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, for our listeners, the maths and the improbabilities are there for you.
Staggering.
And for me, and hence why we're doing this program, is so that you can actually think about these low probabilities. And yeah, just to follow up on what Dr. Bechly said there, was that, in 150 amino chained protein, that is the statistic 1 to 10 to the 77th power to get this. This is a moderate protein chain. I mean, I researched in some, it can be as a few thousand, up to 34,350 is the largest in the human body. But 1 to the 10 to the 77th power, and as he said earlier, there's only about 10 to the 80 atoms in the observable universe. So it's staggering. And another example, another analogy for our listeners would be maybe. And some of my friends buy tickets to the lottery. If you win the lottery once, okay, people, of course, wow, they will congratulate you. It's like, you're very lucky. If you win the lottery the next day, then it's like, wow, you're really lucky. If you win it the third day, and we continue this in a 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, eventually, if you win, 100 times in a row, the people are going to say, surely there's some cheating going on here. So I think if we look about everyday life, we have to really think, do we take the math seriously? Because if we would think that's absurd, that somebody winning the lottery multiple times consecutively, there's some cheating or there's some intelligent thinking here, hence why we call it intelligent design, surely chance. I mean, that's very, very improbable, and hence we would say impossible. And I think this is what we would like, and I think the ID camp is kind of pointing towards the inadequacies of random chance mutations to produce new genetic information, and these new body plans, as we've mentioned in the Cambrian era.
By the way, it's interesting that you mentioned lottery. Because that is one objection that you often hear, is that when you make, for example, this waiting time argument that it takes such and such much longer to get the proper mutation, that you're committing the lottery fallacy or the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, that you basically have a pre-specified target and then you make a circle around it, said, oh, how improbable that we exactly hit there. But this objection makes certain hidden assumptions that are demonstrably false. So one assumption is that there are many other solutions out there, and one evidence against this is this ubiquitous occurrence of convergences in the history of life, and recent decades have more and more shown how often it looks like there are not many different solutions possible, and when there are certain problems for organisms, they find the same solutions, which is quite strange. If there would be many solutions, you would expect to find many different ways to solve the problem. And also this search space problem for proteins shows it doesn't look like there are many functional proteins. These solutions are very rare in the search space. So it's not that we have this vast other possibilities and we just draw a circle around one of them. It's even these points, that these targets are very rare and would require some kind of fine-tuning, initial fine-tuning to even get these few targets. But another problem is that, of course, this objection is an unfalsifiable attempt in saying there could be X that solves the problem. We don't know what it is, but there could be something to explain this. And this is, of course, not how science proceeds. We have to take the evidence we have and then look for the best explanation of all the data. And all the data we have suggest that the waiting time problem is real, and that's the reason why it's also issue in mainstream population genetics and even in cancer research. If it would be so easily solved by saying, oh, there are a lot of options and evolution doesn't care if it finds this option or the other possibility, then this wouldn't be an issue. So the lottery fallacy is no valid objection against these calculations of low probability of these events.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's brilliant. And also, could you comment on? I think you mentioned briefly with Bechly's work with malaria, but because a lot of, whether it's geneticists or evolutionary biologists, will claim we see evolution through bacteria's resistance to antibiotics. Could you comment on how that is different?
Yeah. Sure.
To
I think there's no dispute, even among young Earth creationists, that evolution, in the sense of in the petri dish with a cultivated bacteria, you get drug resistance or something happening. Sure, this happens. There are mutations occurring, and then they are spreading in the population. In all cases that have been observed, for example, these long-term experiments by Richard Lansky, where there was a new function in terms of metabolism developed in Escherichia coli bacteria, is that if you look at the genetic basis, it's either recombination of already existing genes or it is a breaking of an existing gene. There's no documented case where there was a new complex genetic information developed in the petri dish by this kind of evolution. But the other point is, even in Darwin's time, it was already a common critique of Darwin's theory that he made an invalid extrapolation from, let's say, these small variations where we can explain how we get different dog breeds by breeding them, or different cattle by breeding them, to extrapolate to this, how did cattle and dogs arrive in the first place? So to extrapolate from microevolution to macroevolution. And that's again something where the waiting time problem is interesting, because it shows if you combine population genetics, which is just the toolkit to explain how does drug resistance spread in the petri dish for the bacteria. That's microevolution explained mathematically with the toolkit of population genetics, that if you combine this with the fossil record and the available time frame, that this extrapolation of microevolution, just take a lot of microevolution over millions of years and hey, then you have the explanation for macroevolution. It doesn't work, because the available time frames are orders of magnitude too short to allow for the necessary genetic changes.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And that's really good. And another analogy I like which is with software programs. So, you know, when a new operating system, whether it's Microsoft or Apple, come up with a new operating system, there is code behind that operating system. And whatever that code, and I'm going way back, if you remember Windows 97, Windows XP, Windows 2000, you know, we have Windows 10 now. Each of these operating systems have code that is produced by obviously an intelligence, us humans, or so some more intelligent humans than me anyway. But if we then, the idea is with microevolution that code is then tampered upon. You know, we change a few numbers here and there, binary code, whatever. And what we're saying is, after how many years of tampering with the code, we're going to get from Windows 97 or Windows 2000 to Windows 10. I think it's a big jump. And if we don't see that with computer code, or I'm hoping our listeners will see that example or that analogy, as because that's what we're trying to say, right?
Of course. Or also the other example that you had with a book, if you imagine you would have to transfer, let's say, a book by Charles Dickens into a novel by Leo Tolstoy, and the only procedure allowed is random changes of letters and a kind of selecting for, is it still a meaningful story? Can you get from A to B, from one novel to the totally different novel by random changes and selecting the meaningful stories? Of course not, it would never happen. And meaningful stories would translate in this example to a viable organism, because of course in evolution every intermediate step has to be viable. But also for the software example, another often heard counter argument would be, well, but there are these evolutionary algorithms where programs program themselves and they optimize, and sometimes they come up with solutions we never thought of. And isn't this an example that this procedure works? And actually it's not, and don't take my word. I recently stumbled accidentally about an interesting comment by David Deutsch, and David Deutsch is famous quantum physicist and one of the pioneers of quantum computing. And he has a best-selling book called The Beginning of Infinity, and there he elaborates on these evolutionary algorithms. And he is a believer in Darwinian. That's one of the cornerstones of his own philosophy, is Darwinian evolution. So he's not an anti-evolutionist. But concerning these evolutionary programs, he writes, one thing that always seems to happen with such projects is that after they achieve their intended aim, if the evolutionary program is allowed to run further, it produces no further improvements. This is exactly what would happen if all the knowledge in the successful program had actually come from the programmer. Oh, okay, that's exactly what all the critics of these evolutionary programs, intelligent design programs, said. It's, if there is new information generated, it was smuggled in at the beginning by programmers. And that is something that we observe in all those cases. There is no software emulation wherever there happened something like the Cambrian explosion or a transition to a totally new thing in a computer simulation. It should be possible, because with our computational abilities, we could simulate the evolution of millions of years easily within a few days on large computers. So this is also evidence against Darwinian evolution, that there is no such successful example that macroevolution happens in a computer simulation.
I see. No, thank you for that. That's very helpful. So moving on our discussion, I want to talk about the actual theory of ID itself, or intelligent design, because a lot of scientists, mainstream scientists, or even the average person on the street will say it's the God of the gaps, God of the gaps argument, or it's not true science. Could you talk? I mean, so my comments on that, I can say it can be falsified in the sense that in our current way of thinking, any form of information or specified information always requires an intelligent mind. And I always give the example of SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, where, you know, they are looking for whether some code or something that is not purely random, that's specified, that they can attribute to intelligence. So for me, my question, why is ID in some shape or form accepted for SETI, but not for the biological science?
That's a very good question. Yeah, that's exactly the point. So when some people say it's not science, of course, the ridiculous thing is that this ID procedure, this kind of methodology, is totally uncontroversial in a lot of fields. It's not only SETI research, where you look, is a certain signal generated by a quasar or pulsar, or is it from a civilization which is sending us the prime numbers, as in the film Contact, movie Contact. But it's also in archaeology, when you want to find out, is some stone, is it a natural product, or was it a stone tool by an ancient human? Or in forensics, if you want to find out, has somebody died of natural causes, or was it a murder, a homicide, a murder case? Or recently, if you want to find out, is COVID, is it a natural virus, or was it engineered in a lab? In all these cases, or election fraud, is a certain election data, are they plausible, or are there suspicious patterns? In all these cases, we use the same kind of reasoning, and suddenly when you apply it to the biological realm or the cosmological realm, then it's not allowed. Then there is this kind of thinking prohibition. You may go so far, but not further. This is, of course, nonsense. And as you said, this God of the gaps argument is also totally incorrect for several reasons. First, intelligent design does not infer a God. That would transgress the method. It infers evidence for design, for intelligent activity, and how you interpret this, if you think it was God or aliens or time-traveling genetic engineers from the future or whatever, or we're living in the Matrix, which, by the way, suddenly is mainstream. Elon Musk talks about we are living probably in a simulation, and Neil deGrasse Tyson and Martin Rees and famous atheists, they are totally fine with the Matrix hypothesis, but they would say, oh, but intelligent design and biology is pseudoscience. That, of course, is very suspicious, because it looks like it's a certain worldview bias that prohibits to make the same inference in another science. And another comment would be, when they say it's not science at all, that they often will refer to this court ruling of the Dover case in America, where Judge Jones ruled intelligent design is not science, as if it would be the task of a judge in a courtroom to decide what qualifies as science or not. That is not the task of judges. It's not even the task for scientists. It's the task for philosophers of science. And they are totally, there's no consensus. They are divided about the so-called demarcation criteria. What criteria could we use to distinguish science from non-science? And most criteria, including the falsification criterion by Popper or others, when you really apply them strictly, then they would either exclude too much or include too much. So there is no easy way to distinguish if something is science or not science. And then another point that people will come up with is say, well, but you don't make predictions, you don't have a model, and so on, which is total nonsense. If you, it shows just a certain ignorance that people don't read the primary literature on intelligent design and just follow some propaganda. If they look in the literature, Stephen Meyer, in his book Signature of the Cell, he gave a dozen predictions of intelligent design, and some of them are very precise and could be easily falsified. So, for example, one prediction is that no computer simulation will generate new specified information larger than 500 bit. It's a very precise number, which is based on this universal probability bound calculated by Dembski, based on what is the probabilistic resource of our universe, what could happen by chance and what would not be possible. And you just would have to run a simulation program, a program that can generate something really new, which has not been smuggled in through the back door, larger than 500 bit, and you have falsified a core prediction of intelligent design theory. And another famous prediction, which was really made, it's not a theoretical prediction, it was made by Richard from Sternberg and colleagues decades before the empirical finding that the so-called junk DNA is not junk DNA. The prediction from intelligent design was there will be function, and lo and behold, the ENCODE project and other results show that the junk DNA is not junk at all, but works like a kind of operating system. So it's not only making predictions, it's making successful predictions. So which is one of the core features of a true scientific theory. And that's a reason why there are even atheist philosophers of science and scientists, even if they are not intelligent design proponents, but they acknowledge that it is valid science. Like, for example, Thomas Nagel in his book Mind and Cosmos, who says intelligent design is unfairly treated and is a valid approach. He doesn't believe in intelligent design, but he thinks it's fair science. And there has been another book by Bradley Monton called Seeking God in Science, where he says it's totally fulfilling all criteria. He thinks it's not true science in the sense of that the hypothesis, the conclusion is true, but it's valid science in terms of methodology. So saying intelligent design is not science is nonsense on many levels.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you, and in fact, I love your answer there. There's, we have philosophers, scientists who are very sympathetic or would acknowledge ID as science for the reasons that you said in the methodology. One of my favorite clips, I'm sure you hopefully know this one, Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. Yes. Richard Dawkins is even caught attributing the origin of life to some complex alien. Yes. So, you're absolutely right. ID does not specify the identity of the intelligent source for the genetic information or the fine-tuning of the universe. Which does allow for alien super complex, or as you said, the matrix, or we're in a simulation. So my hope is in the future, and I'm hoping obviously the more programs Discovery Institute and the ID proponents do, showing the general public the validity of the science. I'm hoping that it will soon become more mainstream. However, of course, we are yet to wait that time. But I'm hoping our listeners can see from you that this is genuine science for the very reasons it can be falsified. We have made predictions, as you given the example of junk DNA, which otherwise, if we had the Neo-Darwinian model, that prediction wouldn't have been made. So, but bringing this to a close, then I would like could you touch upon, because I know some of our listeners will be young Earth creationists, in the sense they think of a young Earth. Could you talk about maybe the science, because you're a paleontologist, so you would look at the fossils in the the layers of rock. What sort of dating methods would you use to validate the times we've talked about, such as the Cambrian explosion and your respective fossils? If you could comment briefly upon that.
Right. So a common misconception, especially among young Earth creationists, is that they think there is some kind of circular process going on, and paleontologists date the layers with the fossils and then the fossils with the layers. That's nonsense. That's not happening. Or sometimes it is happening, but that's not the general procedure. So usually nowadays we use physical procedures to date the layers, which is not carbon dating, because carbon dating just works till 40, maximal 60,000 years ago, due to the half-life of the carbon isotopes. But there are other radiometric datings using, for example, uranium and lead, or the different argon, kalium, and so on. So you have, for different time horizons, you have different isotopes depending on their half-life that can be used to date these layers. And then when you have dated these layers, then of course you can use, if you find certain fossils only occurs in layers that have been dated with a certain age, then you can use certain fossils that are only existing for a short period of Earth history to date other layers until you have physical dating of these layers themselves. So the best dating, I think, is these different physical procedures. And it's not like it is also often painted in young Earth sources that there are assumptions that could be questioned, so that you have to know how much of the daughter isotopes existed at the beginning, or that you have to assume a constant decay rate, or that's not true with the modern procedures that are used, the isochrone methods, or you don't need these assumptions actually. They are calculated on the fly while doing the dating procedure. They don't have to be put in as a kind of axiom at the beginning of the dating procedure. And then, of course, there are a lot of other results from geology that point, let's say, at least that this time horizon that is usually giving, if you take this biblical picture of, let's say, age of the Earth, something like 5,000 to 6,000 years, that this is impossible. For example, if you have fossil reefs that need a certain time to grow, to be explained, and you find these then in layers, 100 meters of layers of desert sediments above, and then again marine sediments and so on. And also what they usually invoke is, of course, to explain all these geological layers is this 1 year flood. And there is strong evidence that this would not be possible to explain the data. For example, when you take recent whale carcasses, when a whale dies and it sinks to the seafloor, then different successions of invertebrate colonize these corpses of the whale. And the same happened in the past. And we have fossils of ichthyosaurs that show that for many years they were colonized by marine invertebrates that were growing on these died ichthyosaurs, and then became fossilized, where we can show this didn't happen during a 1 year flood, but took many, many years. And so there are a lot of evidences like this. We have the valves, different layers of lake sediments, where we can count the sediments and compare with the radiometric dating, and the counting of the layers corresponds to the dating of the layers according to radiometric dating. And also, if you use different methods of radiometric dating for the same layers, you get congruent results, which also shows that to explain this away, you would need very complex hypotheses. And finally, of course, from physics, if you look at astronomy, and you look at the speed of light maximum and the calculation of distances of star systems and galaxies, it would require absurd hypotheses to explain the structure of our universe in a 5,000 or 6,000 year time frame.
Oh, thank you for that. Thank you for that. I know that will cause controversy, but I mean, the reason I bring this, I feel that it's, and my next question will be to you, is your journey to the Christian faith. But yeah, for me, and just before you answer that, for our listeners, so just to summarize as well, we've talked about the importance of genetic information and the need to introduce new genetic information at each of these stages in prehistoric life, with these new body plans and so on, organs and so on. And at what the idea is, theory is stating that an intelligent mind, some sort of intelligence, is responsible, or should be responsible, for these distinct events in our past. As to the nature that the identity, that's another question. And so, and as we've said, we have non-Christians supporting the ID camp, as well as Christians. But so obviously I'm a Christian scientist, but I would also like to hear your last question, Dr. Beckley, what is your story, and how did you come to the faith?
Okay, that would of course be a long story, so I try to make it short.
Yep.
So I have no religious background whatsoever, so which of course is something where the red lights go on for atheists. Oh, another one who says, I have been an atheist and then I got converted by the evidence. I was a total atheist. I hated Christianity. I thought religion is some medieval superstition, nonsense, bullshit. I didn't care about it. I was not baptized. I never went to church except in vacation to make some photos of a nice church. And otherwise, I didn't care not even about philosophical problems. So that was never an issue for me until my late 30s. And then I didn't have any kind of epiphany or religious experience. It started with an interest, a popular science level interest in modern physics. And then I explored all these kind of popular science books by Stephen Hawking and Feynman and Brian Greene and so on. And soon found certain problems that are involved by physics concerning the question of causality and how can you explain this correspondence of mathematics to the physical realm, and evidence against materialism from quantum mechanics and so on. So I went on a journey, and this journey brought me relatively soon away from materialism. And then I looked for other worldviews that could make sense of this. And for a long time, I have been a process thinker in terms of Whiteheadian process metaphysics. That was still the case when I became an intelligent design proponent. So intelligent design, when I came to intelligent design, I was not a theist, not a Christian, and came for totally scientific reasons, a critic of Neo-Darwinism and a proponent of intelligent design, and still do. I have no theological problems with Darwinian evolution. My faith wouldn't be shaken if Darwinian evolution would be true after all. I don't interpret Genesis in terms of literal 24-hour stories, or I think there is something else much more subtle going on in Genesis, and would be relatively liberal in my interpretation, more in terms like John Walton's interpretation of Genesis, like a temple inauguration ceremony. So religion didn't play a role in my conversion to intelligent design, but parallel to this, I explored these philosophical questions. And then ultimately, I discovered there's some inconsistency in process metaphysics that cannot be resolved. And then I explored idealism and other worldviews. I'm still a kind of idealist, but a theistic idealist. But ultimately, I thought that I had to look into theism as the last man standing, and was totally against my predispositions. I didn't like theism, but the arguments were undeniable. So I had to bow to the evidence, and it was not so much something like the beginning of the universe, which convinces many people, like the Kalam argument, but all these arguments, the argument from reason, how can you explain logic and reason, the correspondence of mathematics and the natural sciences, and the fine-tuning of the universe. And that, by the way, is one point where the identity of the designer, of course, is more evident, because in biology, as you said, you could infer aliens or the matrix hypothesis. In cosmology, where by definition the intelligent source, whatever it is, would have to be outside of our space-time domain, of course, could not be aliens. And there, of course, you can more easily infer a kind of designer that meets the criteria of God in classical theism. And I very much recommend a recent book by Stephen Meyer called The Return of the God Hypothesis, where he makes this case. So ultimately, I looked into different, in theism, I found theism is the most convincing worldview. Then I looked into different world religions. And then it was for different reasons, historical reasons, historical evidence for the resurrection, and for the reliability of the gospel reports, in spite of course, there are inconsistencies and anachronisms and problems that have to be solved, contradictions and so on. But ultimately, if you use standard criteria of secular history, then you come to the point where you say, well, the resurrection is a very, very well-established event that can not be easily explained otherwise, or where the best explanation is that it really happened, and that ultimately brought me to Christianity.
Thank you, Dr. Bechly. Yeah, and I have a lot of parallels with you with regards to, and I want to mention to our listeners the Christian faith. If you are a Christian, hinges on the historicity, life, death, and resurrection of Christ, as opposed to all these other arguments of the universe or intelligent design, which can of course support that, but the ultimate sticking pin is that the believer rise from the dead. So yeah, anyway, I would encourage, for those listeners who are seeking the Christian faith, please look into that. But just before we end, I just want to, this is a bit a comedic thing. I have this book on, it's called The Molecular Biology of the Cell. You can see how thick it is. And what I say to people, because during Darwin's time, they thought the cell was very simplistic. The origin of life, this is the first life was unicellular. So, even you can go on Wikipedia, just type single cellular life, whatever, lots and lots of information to read about this. So it is a very big problem, real problem in biological science, that they still have not found a naturalistic explanation of getting biological life from non-life, or that so-called prebiotic soup. So it is still a big question. And of course, what the ID camp suggests is, with biological information or specified complex information, is we need a intelligent mind. I want to say thank you to Dr. Bechly for his time, for the hour and a half that he's given to us today, and we hope that will be useful to our listeners.
Thanks for having me. So thank you.
Thank you.